Hello.
All right, I think we are officially live on YouTube. If people can, if people can see us and hear us, give us a thumbs up in the chat, and we'll go from there. And then also, lobsters, if you guys can see us or hear us, please give us put some comments in the chat or give us a like, and we'll see it.
Oh, it's gone.
All right. Oh man. Okay, here we go. No
Okay, I
comments yet
see us on
on.
YouTube now.
Great, we're live. All right, awesome. Well, let's get everyone introduced. I'm Alejandro, your host, also known as Roughstone Trolling. You can find me on Twitter. Just look up Roughstone Trolling, and then if you want to, join the hot mess, join Latter Day Lobsters and Sorted Saints, and on Facebook. And trust me, it's the best LDS Facebook group you'll find on the internet. It's I don't want to say it's uncensored because that sounds dirty. We're pretty clean, but we're very much into free speech, so you can say just about anything, just about. Um, anyway, I'm joined today with my good friend and top lobster, Trevor Larson. Thanks for
What's up,
joining us, and
guys?
thanks for your help getting this set up. And then, of course, I'm joined with my wonderful guests. We got Don and Jasmine Bradley. Just
Right.
introduce them a little bit. Don is a historian, and he's well known for his work on the Lost 116 Pages. If you don't have a copy of this, I highly recommend getting a copy. His work on polygamy with Brian Howes is also of very high quality. And then Don, you're kind of also well known for kind of having a really interesting faith journey where you left the church and then came back. So, I'd love to pick your brain. And you're joined today with your lovely wife, Jasmine. Um, Jasmine, you're kind of new to a lot of viewers. Don or Jasmine, maybe you guys could introduce Jasmine a bit,
Sure.
tell us a little about yourself and stuff like that.
So we just found out that Alejandro's mom and my mom went to the same school in Mexico, which was an LDS boarding school. It is now the Mexico MTC. So that's kind of a cool connection. So yeah, I've just been hanging out in Mormon spaces for a long time. My dad's family is from Community of Christ, so I have a bit of a different, more nuanced perspective on a lot of these issues. So yeah, just love hanging out.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and it's so cool that our moms know each other. Like, what are the chances?
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Awesome. So this is an MAA and Ask Me Anything. So we'll start with some questions, and we're gonna divide up the hour into kind of four sections. First, we're gonna start with things like faith crises and things like that, and then we'll move on to other topics. So there's one question we got on Messenger that I thought was actually a really great place to start. Let me actually pull that up. Jasmine, do you have that question? I think you sent it to us.
I
It was
did.
from was it from Daniel?
Yes, Daniel, he asked a really good question, and maybe, do you want me to send it over to you, or would you like me to read it?
No, just go. Well, let me see if I can find it here. I think you sent it. So I'll read it here real fast. So this is from Daniel Brett Stark, a top lobster in our circles. He says, "What do you or why do you think some people go through major faith crisis when they find out X, Y, and Z is difficult information surrounding Mormonism, while others don't experience any kind of crisis of faith after learning that exact same information?"
I'm starting to tie
So,
that from nose.
okay, great. So let's start with you two. What do you what's your guys' sort of take on that, or just from your life experience? Why do you think that's the case that some people might run into such information, have a faith crisis, and other people might not?
So before we dive into that question, I want to say first, Jasmine and I are newlyweds and very madly in love. So
Oh.
we're happy to switch together into this small frame on the couch. Um, Jasmine is humble. She didn't say that much about herself. She has been engaging she's had her own very complex faith journey where she's had a lot to integrate. She's done very high level thought work and spiritual work within the restoration and has familiarized herself with quite a few restoration groups. She mentioned that on one side of her family. Her family's from the Community of Christ. And we actually met because of our common interest in Mormon history. She's done a lot on the history of delving into like the history of polygamy, and also exploring the lived experience of polygamy in modern day polygamous groups and so on. So that's a little more of her personal background and some of the great context that she brings to these discussions.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, you can maybe.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, as Jasmine said, this is a really good question. Do you want me to take a crack at it first, or would you like to go first?
I can go
Sure, go
first. I mean, I've identified quite a few things as to why people have faith crises, specifically from a woman's perspective. There's psychological approach. There's like a theological or spiritual approach to it. And the historical approach. So there's multiple reasons, and oftentimes they actually kind of feed off of each other. So from my experience, actually diving into the questions and having a really open dialogue about it is actually what tends to remedy a lot of the really intense emotions around what people are experiencing. There's some hard history, and working through it with really good mental health. It actually, I have found, has been really empowering. So as far as the psychological issues, I think that there's the 10 main psychological thought flaws. Those are things like black and white thinking, that's equating fallacies, that type of things, those types of ideas. So I've taking a more extensive approach on faith issues, I feel like has been the best way forward for me. I think a lot of people avoid, and I have found personally that that's kind of the worst, because that has led to a lot of suppression, which it seems like the body holds. So to actually talk about it in a really happy and healthy, holistic and emotionally sensitive environment seems to be the way that people can really work through these issues and feel a lot of peace. So
yeah. Yeah. And one thing that Jasmine and I would agree on for sure also is that I think as I approach answering the question, I would think that I would caution against blaming people who have faith crises, because one possibility is that someone might take the answers that we give and then think, oh, well, the person who's having a faith crisis, they're just failing to do X, Y, Z, so it's kind of their fault. I don't think that's how it works, right? I mean, people have different emotional constitutions. People have been taught to think in different ways, and often in Latter-day Saint culture, people have been encouraged to do black and white thinking. So if your culture teaches you to do black and white thinking and you do black and white thinking, is that a surprise? Is that your fault? Is that a personal flaw? Or is that something that's been enculturated into you, right? So I would heavily caution against blaming the person who has the faith crisis. And since Jasmine and I are both people who've had our own major faith crises, right? Like we would be the last people to blame someone for having a faith crisis, right? But like she was saying, I think that someone's complexity of thought is certainly going to be one of the things that would tend to insulate them against a faith crisis, right? So if someone has a sort of black and white view that maybe they feel like they know in advance how perfect a prophet has to be, or how big a mistake God would accept a prophet making, and the prophet could still be a prophet. So I've had people tell me, well, I can believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet as long as he didn't do X, right? And so then if they encounter reason to think that maybe he did do X, then suddenly their faith is up in the air, right? And I think actually this happens for people with a lot of different things. It happens with polygamy is a big one, or aspects of his polygamy. If he did that, I can't believe that he was a prophet. Or, something else, other things,
Treasure digging, dishonesty. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah. If he ever, every human being has self-interest, but if Joseph Smith ever manifested self-interest, he couldn't be a prophet. Or, definitely black and white thinking would be a major pitfall. I think, like Jasmine said, tackling issues head on is something that, at least in the long run, is going to tend to be healthier for people. I did a paper several years ago on what are called the Kinderhook plates, and this had been perceived as a real apologetic problem, right? Because the Kinderhook plates are plates that were brought to Joseph Smith in 1843 after supposedly being found in a mound in Illinois. And he reportedly translated part of them and said something that they contained. And then many years later, it was shown that the Kinderhook plates were actually a forgery. And so then the critical argument was only a bogus prophet translates bogus plates. And so a number of Latter-day Saint apologists started denying that Joseph Smith had translated from the Kinderhook plates, even though there was good evidence that he had, because, how could a true prophet translate from fake plates? Well, I, at the time that I was doing some of this research, I wasn't actually a believer. I was outside the church. And I started trying to figure out, well, how did he derive the text that he's supposed to have translated from the Kinderhook plates? I actually figured out that he wasn't claiming to have translated them by revelation. He was comparing characters on the Kinderhook plates with characters in another source, and that's how he derived his translation, right? And so he wasn't purporting to translate as a prophet. And so the solution to the perceived problem was actually not avoiding it by denying it, was delving deeper into the problem to try to figure out the history, what was actually going on. Right. And so for me at least, that's a kind of model where going into something can be much healthier than denying or trying to avoid. I would also say that if people try to stay afloat emotionally and spiritually when they're struggling with faith issues, that goes a long way, because in my own experience, like faith crises can be so painful. Having doubts about things that you built your life on is just, I think, inherently painful. And so often people get sort of hyper focused on the problem when there's a lot of research in positive psychology to show that the more we focus on something negative, the less creative our brain becomes, and the less able our brain is to see new possibilities. And so the more that we keep ourselves afloat emotionally, like Jasmine said, watching out for our mental health, keeping up our connections with other people,
physical health, emotional health.
Right. Maybe practicing gratitude, doing spiritual practice. The wider our window of perception is, the more we can see additional possibilities beyond just the black and white dichotomy. And so maybe for me personally, that was a big part of figuring out my way back to the church, is I was depressed. And so, of course, I just saw black and white possibilities. Once I really elevated my happiness by really diving into practicing gratitude, I was able to see a wider range of possibilities. And if I hadn't done that spiritual practice of gratitude, I wouldn't have come back, because I would have always been stuck. My mind would have been stuck in the black and white, instead of being able to see the wider range of possibilities that the mind sees when we're happy.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. It's so thorough. That's so much to think on. And a lot of what you said, to me, sort of touches on some of the stuff that I'm learning at BYU, kind of with my study in psychology. So, for example, our lab studies moral development. And so Sam Hardy and Emily Taylor specifically did a lit review where they tried to understand, like, why adolescents in particular might leave religion. And so they're looking at different predictors and things like that. And one of the studies that they came across was a study where they examined, like, personality predictors that predicted, like, leaving religion. And so what they found was that there was one predictor, or more like two predictors, that predicted people staying in religion, and that was being high in like having a high rating and being open in your personality. So you're like open to new ideas, open to novel experiences. Yeah. And then there's conscientiousness, which is something like, how organized or industrious you are. So that's one thing they found. That's one data point. The second one was they actually did a study on activity rates in education. And so for people who were Jewish and Protestants, the more educated you were, the less likely you were to be active in your faith. I think it was actually kind of flat. Like there was no relationship between Catholicism and education. But for Latter-day Saints, it was the opposite of Jewish and Protestant people, where the higher educated you were, the more likely you were to be active in the faith. And that's remarkable on its own. But speaking back to personality, like if you're a very highly educated person, you're of course very open to new ideas, because all you're doing is studying new ideas. And if you've done the work to get the degree, that higher degree, then you're obviously conscientious because you've like put in the work and like have turned in all the homework to get your degree. And then how does that relate to depression? Well, one way to think about depression is like your body literally assesses like your environment, and it says this is not worthwhile, so I'm actually gonna like shut down. Like the cost to benefit ratio is so like skewed that I'm not like, it's not worth trying. And that's why people stay in bed all day, because they're like, oh, like it's actually like it costs me a lot to get out of bed and to go do my day. And so when it comes to like faith crisis and looking up history, it's like reading all the literature and thinking about these problems actually takes a lot of energy. And so I think on the one hand, if people are experiencing mental health issues, we should be understanding that these people are likely to be exhausted. They're likely to become frustrated more quickly. And so like if they are trying to learn church history, it's going to be an uphill battle because it's so costly for them. And that's not, again, that's just that's not to say that they're lazy, because I mean, right, coming from a Hispanic background, right, my uncles would say, just put your batteries in, get to work, but of course with mental health issues and your personality, some people are not as open, they're not as conscientious, and some people, if they're experiencing mental health issues, then it actually might even be more costly for them to like engage in that hard cognitive work to like dig through the sources and then like rethink their position. So
there's such a range. I appreciate that analysis a lot, and you sharing things from the research. There's such a range of human personalities, right? And people all have different strengths, and that leads people to do different things. I used to think more that like more people should be like me. Personally, I'm a scholar, I'm a bookworm, I dig into the sources, very intellectual. I used to think, oh, everybody should be more like that. And while I think that on the whole, it would be good for people to engage more with information, it would be good for us to have higher levels of education, and that's beneficial to society. The fact is that different kinds of careers, different kinds of roles in society require different kinds of personalities and different kinds of strengths. That benefits everyone. And some of those kinds of strengths some of those very kind of strengths, even though they are patterns of strengths and weaknesses, even though they're good for certain things, they might predispose some people more to a faith crisis than others. And I think that just being understanding of that if people have a faith crisis, again, it's not not to treat it as a flaw in them, but to be understanding and to try to elevate them.
Yeah.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So I want to hear just a little bit about your journey real quick, Don. You say on your Facebook profile, you say, "It is not as a child that I believe and confess Jesus Christ. My Hosanna is born of a furnace of doubt." And I love that. I absolutely love that.
Actually, thank you. That's Dostoevsky. But because Facebook only lets you put a certain amount of text. I couldn't put it in quotes, and I couldn't put his name. I could only put.
It's okay. We'll attribute it to you. It's all good.
I'm attributing it to Don. You give credit, man.
To quote it so that in future books it'll be quoted as Don Bradley instead of Dostoevsky. Sure.
Yeah, it's definitely Don Bradley. Yeah, 100%. So, I just wanted to hear a little bit about, and maybe people here are more familiar about this than I am, because I'm sure you've shared about this before, but just a little bit about your faith journey, about what initially led you out of the church,
Sure.
and then what led you back in. What were the emotional experiences that you had inside and out, and then what eventually led you back in? Maybe what role that spiritual experiences played in all that.
Sure.
And just the whole journey, just what eventually led you back into the church.
Sure. So given that I've done entire podcasts on this where I felt like the whole podcast was a tiny nutshell of the journey, it's harder to nutshell the nutshell.
Okay. Yeah.
But I will try.
Okay.
So there are plenty of podcasts people can go to, like my episode with Let's Get Real with Stephen Jones would be one example of a more extensive discussion of this if people want. I started doing archival research in church history when I was 17 years old. My first church history project was on the origin and demise of the Adam God theory. So I didn't exactly start, of course I had no attraction to controversy or anything like that, right? So
Sure.
I was a bit precocious and unusual for my age, obviously. That I encountered doubt first when I was at that age, because I actually encountered a book that B.H. Roberts wrote back, a manuscript he wrote back in like the 1930s, that was published several decades later as Studies of the Book of Mormon. He never intended it to be published. It was his devil's advocate case against the Book of Mormon. And so I literally found it at Deseret Book during family home evening. As a family home evening activity, we went to Deseret Book, and I found it there in the general authority section. So I had no idea what I was getting myself into in reading that book, but it just kind of rocked my world, and struggled with some doubt then as a teenager, kind of thought I figured things out to some extent, went on a mission, came back, resumed my research, and started finding more and more. I like to explain to people that when you're doing your own first-person research, it's really different from reading about things that other people have researched. So if you're reading a Latter-day Saint historian talking about our history, they have already integrated everything intellectually and to some extent spiritually for you. But when you're doing your own research, that burden of intellectual and spiritual integration falls entirely on you. And that's what I was experiencing, right? So I'm like in my 20s, and I'm finding new things in the history of Joseph Smith. And the narrative that I was piecing together increasingly diverged from the narrative that I'd been told. In that, I thought for a while I could bridge the gap, and eventually I became unable to bridge the gap. And my faith is kind of, after building doubts for several years, it just kind of imploded, right? Sort of the last evidentiary supports for it seemed to fall away. And I continued being active in the church for a while because I thought it was a good thing, but I didn't believe, right? And then after about 4 years of continuing to be active, I gave up, right? I'd become increasingly disillusioned with Joseph Smith. I had more questions about his honesty. I saw more things that disturbed me, where I looked and I was perceiving self-serving behavior on his part. I had real problems with aspects of his polygamy, among other things. And I put in a letter resigning my membership from the church, right? And so I, during that time, I also was really troubled by the problem of evil and suffering, especially the suffering of children. And so I stopped believing in God. And so I was outside of the church, and I was an atheist. So I was an ex-Mormon atheist. I was really active in ex-Mormon social circles. During that time, I felt somewhat conflicted because I thought that in many ways the church was a good thing. Some people in the ex-Mormon world told me that they'd had a really terrible experience growing up in the church. That I didn't invalidate their experience, but it wasn't mine, right? My experience was positive. That's not why I left. And so I felt like my research was really undermining the truth claims, would lead a lot of people out of the church. And that felt painful to me. I didn't fully know what to do with that, After a period of a few years outside of the church, I actually encountered, and again, people can listen to a variety of other podcasts for details. I encountered arguments about cosmology first that really kind of blew my mind about what's called the problem of the fine-tuning of the universe for the existence of life. There were things about the orderliness of the universe and so on that started raising questions about my atheism. I encountered what I took to be really solid reasons to think that maybe there was a mind behind the universe, maybe there was a God. So I started reconsidering that. I fell back on personal experiences that I had, one in particular that had saved my life. It was a spiritual experience, a revelation that had warned me not to go out in front of a car that I couldn't have known was not going to stop at a particular crosswalk, right, that I was about to cross. And anyway, so I came to believe in God again. Then I had a kind of reconversion to Christ. And I really did not think I could come back to the church. I thought Joseph Smith was a fraud. I thought I was an opportunist. I didn't think I could come back to the church. I joined the Baha'i faith, which is a very expansive, egalitarian faith with a beautiful vision to it. I was happy there. And then but I continued doing my Mormon history research, and I started finding that Joseph Smith's first vision, as wild as it may sound in the abstract without laying out all the evidence, was a kind of endowment experience. And that had been nowhere on my map. I had thought that Joseph Smith wouldn't have known anything about the Nauvoo endowment until 1842 when he became a Freemason. And instead, I was finding that actually it was there in his first vision. It was there in other things. And I thought, where is this coming from? I started seeing that there was a deep complexity to the early spiritual visionary narratives he was giving that seemed not to fit with an opportunistic 14 or 15-year-old, and it started raising a lot of questions for me. I saw real power in those narratives. And
you had a faith crisis of your faith crisis, right?
Yeah, in a way I did.
Faith crisis squared.
Sort of a meta faith crisis. Yeah, faith crisis squared.
Right?
Yeah.
So, again, not shelling things, not providing satisfactory detail. There are other podcasts, right? About that.
Sure.
But it really started making me think about my past spiritual experiences, my experience with the Restoration, and thinking how actually there'd been so much in it that was so positive in my life, and maybe I should judge it on that. And I really had a deep desire to contribute to the community that had created me. And I realized my work could do that. The things that I was finding were powerful. And so I initiated a process of returning to the church. I was shocked at how quick that process was, how welcomed back I was. And it was really one of the most beautiful and profound experiences of my life, how I was re-embraced by the church and the Latter-day Saint community. And I have been deeply happy to be back in my spiritual family.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And now I have to hear that interview, the longer detail one. So I'm super excited about that. That'd be great. It's probably about time to, unless Alejandro, you had something else, I think it's probably about time to go to phase 2.
Sure. Yeah. And Don, thank you for sharing that. I totally felt the emotion there. And I'm so glad that you shared that with us, and that you had such a positive experience. I'm glad you can share that with others. I know someone here that's gonna help someone here today. So
Yeah, that was
I'm really
beautiful.
glad to hear that, man.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you, a question about the lost 116 pages, and then I have a few questions from the YouTube chat that I want to ask you. So, I started reading this this week in preparation for this discussion, and I'll just be upfront. History is actually my weakest field. You know, I'm more into psychology and science and philosophy, and then history is sort of like, actually, since I was a kid, history was something I hesitate to enjoy it, you know. But Mormon history is my favorite field of history, so
Yeah.
so that's good. But
Well,
I started reading the.
quick comment there. So
Sure.
I talk to a lot of people who, when I tell them I'm a historian, they say, "Oh, I never liked history in school, like all those names and dates." And I'm like, I didn't like that stuff either, right? Like memorizing a bunch of names and dates seems kind of meaningless. I was my older brother when I was growing up was really into history, like military history. I really wasn't that much. I kind of got into military history a tiny bit because he was into it. I People don't understand history. When you're doing history, it's not memorizing names and dates. It's detective work. And it's so much fun to piece together the lives of people in the past and their motives and solve mysteries about the past. And so I understand, right, when people are not into history, but I think often when they're not, it's because they have experienced history in a very different way than I get to as a historian.
No, wonderful, yeah, and I think you sort of have your finger on the button. Like, that was my experience of learning history in school too, just names and dates and geography, and it's like. But yeah, I think detective work it captures sort of like the rush you can feel sometimes. So, okay, so here's sort of my experience reading the book. I started in chapter 1,
Nice.
and you
That's not a
start
good
with.
place to start, by the way.
So I started there, and you start with talking about the Jewish calendar and the feast days and things like that.
Yeah.
And my first impression of the book was, or at least of that section was, um, that seems like an interesting coincidence, but does this prove anything? But then I thought about that a bit further, and I thought, oh, wait a second, this is a history book.
Yeah, right.
It's to me, my impression was actually you're trying to ground Joseph Smith's history within a broader history, which includes biblical history and religious history. And so my question was that your intention with sort of bringing up, or at least one of your intentions, bringing up the Jewish holidays and stuff? Is that, like, what function does that have in your argument when you build this case up from the ground up? Because you start there, and I was curious why you started there,
Sort of.
and what function does that
Let me
play?
provide some context for the audience. So the book itself is divided into 2 sections, and the first I would call the history of the lost pages, and the second I would call the history in the lost pages. So basically the distinction there is part 1 is about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the translation of the lost pages. So who were the scribes for the lost pages? What was the translation instrument or set of instruments used? So there's controversy, right, about the seer stones versus the interpreters or Urim and Thummim. Who stole the manuscript? Why was Martin Harris so pesky and insisting on borrowing the manuscript? Things like that. Part 2 is what we can piece together about the missing stories based on internal clues in the Book of Mormon text we do have. Early Joseph Smith revelation, statements by Joseph Smith Sr., Martin Harris, and so on, right? Using those puzzle pieces of those different clues and kind of piecing them together again like a detective. And it's going to be a theme in what I'll say about history tonight, is doing history is detective work. And that's, I think, really honestly probably the best entry point for people in understanding what a historian does, is that think of a detective, right? They piece clues together, they make inferences. They don't just take somebody's word for it and say, well, this source said this, so that's exactly how it happened. a good detective always questions the sources, tries to see how the different testimonies conflict with each other, go along with each other. Why would someone have said something this way while someone else said it that way? What is the gap between their testimonies tell us, and so on, right? So in part one, I start out trying to give a background of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, because that's actually going to become significant. I have to admit, one part of the reason I put in the Jewish festivals thing, which I'll explain to the audience in just a second, is because it was so cool that it was irresistible. I actually pieced that stuff together while I was finishing writing the manuscript and about to send it to the publisher. And my editor was a little bit frustrated with me because I was taking extra time to add those things. They were irresistibly cool. So that's part of the, if you're asking why those are in there, that's reason number one, probably, is they were irresistibly
Awesome.
cool. So, but also, I make arguments later in part two that Jewish festivals actually play a role in the Book of Mormon's own narrative. That in the lost, we have a source from Joseph Smith Sr. where he says that when Nephi is going to get the brass plates, Laban, we all know it says in First Nephi, Laban was drunk. But he says Laban was drunk because there was a great feast going on at the time. So apparently one of the Jewish festivals. And so then I explore how the clues in our extant Book of Mormon text, our available text, confirm a festival context. And I argue we can identify the festival itself as Passover. And so part of the reason why I lay out the stuff that Jewish festivals were involved in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon is I'm actually preparing the reader for how Jewish festivals will come in and talking about the content of the Book of Mormon in the lost pages in part two. So that's another reason. So I'm not actually trying to prove anything. So when you say, well, what does this prove? I'm not trying to prove, this isn't trying to prove, oh, the Book of Mormon's historical because Joseph Smith bring forth the Book of Mormon on Jewish feast days or anything like that. I think it's cool and interesting and significant in itself. So basically what I lay out in those opening chapters is Joseph Smith tells us the exact day that he and Emma, not actually just him, the sources show he and Emma went up to the hill together. Her role in the restoration has been vastly underestimated, okay? He went with her. He said the messenger told him he had to take her with him to the hill in order to get the plates. So it wasn't just this wasn't a one-man show, because it wasn't just one person and it wasn't just a man, right? This was Joseph and Emma had to go to the hill together to get the plates. They got the plates, and the day they got them, Joseph tells us, is September 22nd, 1827. That happens to be the Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish festival New Year, right? Also known as Yom Kippur. So then we have another source where one of Joseph Smith's neighbors, Willard Chase, says that 10 days later, so Joseph initially, he takes the plates, he hides them up on the hill Cumorah in a hollowed out log. 10 days later, the neighbor says, he goes and he retrieves the plates and brings them home. But if you look at the Jewish festival calendar, 10 days after the beginning of Rosh Hashanah is the Day of Atonement. Did I just say, no, so, okay, Rosh Hashanah. So the Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur, right? So then Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, tells us that 4 days after he brought the plates home, he first uses the interpreters that came with the plates to receive revelation. Well, 4 days after Yom Kippur is the beginning of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, right? And so, well, that's kind of wild, right? So all the first three events of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon are all key to the exact days of the Jewish festivals. And that's something I didn't put in the book, but later put in an online article. Okay, when you look at what does Rosh Hashanah celebrate? Well, one thing that it commemorates, there's the blowing of the horns on, or shofar on Yom Kippur. That commemorates what the Bible reports in Exodus as the blowing of trumpets at Mount Sinai at the time of the giving of the law, okay? So Moses is said in that narrative to have been up on the mountain 40 days while he's given the tablets that had God's writing on them, okay? these tablets are then placed in a stone, or sorry, these stone tablets are then placed in a golden container, the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so we have stone tablets and a gold ark. Joseph Smith goes to the hill on the day that commemorates that, and he gets gold tablets in a stone ark. Martin Harris refers to the stone box he finds them in as an ark. Okay, so it's like an inversion of the biblical pattern. So I found that the next event after those Jewish festival days in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon is Joseph Smith takes the plates and he transports them down to Pennsylvania. We happen to have from Martin Harris the exact day that happens on. It was November 1st. I looked at it, I'm like, well, that's not a Jewish festival day. That day doesn't have any significance. Until I counted the number of days from the day he got the plates up on the hill to the day he took them down to Pennsylvania, it was exactly 40 days. How long was Moses up on the mountain getting the tablets? 40 days. So the early events in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon are all keyed to this Jewish context, this Jewish festival calendar. I don't think that's coincidence, right? But whatever one makes of it, there's something fascinating going on there.
Very cool. Thank you again for such a thorough answer. That is fascinating, and thank you for illuminating that. That's amazing.
Sure.
Let me switch to another question. This is from Robert Boylan. He wrote in the YouTube comments, as Don wrote in the 116 pages, what is his response to the claim that it is sus that Joseph Smith did not retranslate the Book of Lehi, etc.?
So I do talk about this in the book. So, of course, it's one of the most common criticisms of the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith did not just retranslate the lost manuscript when it was stolen. Okay? And there's even, of course, the infamous Mormon South Park episode that tries to parody this and say this is the thing that shows the obvious fraud, that Mormonism is an obvious fraud because of this, right? And so people may have probably watched that at some point, right? With the little ditty, right? Like Lucy Harris, smart, Martin Harris, dumb, right? And so was it so dumb for people to believe that there was a conspiracy at this time? So that revelation that talks about this conspiracy was given in May 1829, okay? So one of the things that I lay out in the book is that the idea that there were conspiracies against the coming forth of the Book of Mormon wasn't crazy at all. There had already been several of them, okay? So the first conspiracy that I can identify against the coming forth of the Book of Mormon is that as soon as Joseph Smith comes back from the hill on September 22nd, 1827, there are people trying to steal the plates. The group of treasure diggers that Joseph Smith had previously been involved with, they feel like, as former treasure digging companions, they had a right to whatever treasure Joseph Smith found. The golden plates are obviously a wonderful treasure. So they felt like they had a right to it. Joseph wasn't sharing. So they made various raids on the Smith property trying to steal the plates, right? So that's conspiracy number one against the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Lucy Mack Smith tells us in her family memoir that Martin Harris's son-in-law, Flanders Dyke, whom we can show came from a family of swindlers, stole the Anthon transcript as part of some weird conspiracy they thought would discredit the Anthon transcript and therefore the Book of Mormon. And prior to the revelation of D&C 10 about the manuscript theft, saying that was part of a conspiracy, Lucy Harris, Martin's wife, makes a lawsuit against Joseph Smith where she's claiming that Joseph Smith was trying to defraud their family of their money by getting Martin to invest in this book. And she gathers testimony from 3 locals in Palmyra or Manchester, around where the Smiths live. But the testimony itself is clearly fraudulent because it doesn't match with the historical accounts that we have. It has claims, for instance, so we know that Joseph was reporting to his family for 4 years before he recovers the plates, that he had a revelation from an angel about the plates. Well, the testimony is from Peter Ingersoll is actually claiming that Joseph Smith came up with the claim of having the plates on the spot, that one day he found some really pretty white sand. So here's a great story. He found some really pretty white sand. He put it in a bag. He took it home, and when people asked him what he was, he suddenly thought, "I'm going to tell him it's a gold Bible," right? And he claims that this is where the story of the gold plates came from. Well, it doesn't match any of the historical sources showing that Joseph was actually reporting for 4 years before he got the plates that he was going to go get them. He didn't come up with this on the spot. So this was another conspiracy against the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So given that there had already been 3 conspiracies in a short time against the coming forth of the Book of Mormon before D&C 10, why is it so crazy that D&C 10 says there was a 4th conspiracy? And why is it so crazy that the early Latter-day Saints would have believed that? I just don't see why.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. Let's go to some more YouTube questions. Let's see what we got here. So here's a good one. Here are 2 questions, but I'll turn it into 1 question. And try to answer this to the best of your ability. But the question is, how reliable, accurate is the church's publication of Saints, Volume 1 on Joseph Smith? And what are some aspects of church history that you believe may have been neglected, but maybe shouldn't have?
Okay, interesting. So, did you read Saints, baby?
I did not.
Okay.
No.
I actually have not read it through completely.
Well, I've heard a lot of women who do not believe that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy refer to saints. That's like
Criticizing it, you mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
they've read it and
Super
that's
interesting.
that it didn't
Really?
happen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I have not read it through. I have mined it. As a researcher, I tend to read books these days through from cover to cover less than I mine books, right? So I have read selectively
Footnotes,
parts of it.
sources, yeah.
Parts that I have read relevant to my own research have seemed to actually do a good job of fleshing out certain aspects of early Mormonism that maybe we didn't otherwise know.
Yeah.
I don't have direct experience working on the Saints Project. I do have direct experience working in the Joseph Smith papers on Documents Volume 1. So this is the earliest Joseph Smith documents, so from 1825 through 1829.
Yeah.
I know that some people are skeptical about was this a sort of a faith promoting project or whatever. I can tell you from inside experience in the church history department, in the Joseph Smith Papers project, the scholars on that project were trying to do straight scholarship.
Yeah.
It's not like people were not praying to find out what happened. Not that I'm dismissing praying about things, right? But they were doing straight scholarship, right? They were just trying to use the best intellectual tools. There are people at the Joseph Smith Papers, like my friend Mark Ashurst McGee, like my friend Robin Jensen, top-notch minds, very systematic. So my impression from experience inside the church history department is that people there are really trying to do top-notch scholarly work. Your second question, could you repeat it so I have it exactly?
Yeah, the second question was something like, what are some aspects of church history that have been neglected but maybe should not have been?
You want to go with that first? Or you want me to?
Oh, women. Women have a really hard time with talking about certain things because there is no Heavenly Mother that we can easily access for women-specific issues. So I'm not talking about general human suffering issues. I'm talking about issues like infertility, periods, child rearing multiple times to where it's excessive, things that are signature to women. And so I think that I've discovered that there's a lot of early church history that really pulled my spirituality full circle and allowed me to actually calm down about Mormonism not being so traumatic, because it's very male, and maleness is just magnificent in its own way, but it's not femaleness. And so not only is there not a cultivation of spiritual gifts, there's really not an outlet for female based suffering. And so, I mean, the ideas of not having a heavenly mother, it's hard to pray to Heavenly Father about things that are very female specific periods and infidelities and rapes and things that I've heard lots of women talk about. I mean, polygamy in and of itself, there's a lot of female issues that it really is signature to women. So something I really struggled with in my faith was not having a deity that was female that understood specifically what I was suffering, since it was a female specific issue. So and the more I dive into church history, the more I realize there is a lot of feminine spirituality, especially in the early Mormon historical record. There's a lot of appealing to the Heavenly Mother or Heavenly Mothers, whether people think about it laterally or linear, as in generations. There's a lot of appeal to Heavenly Mothers. And that's really healing. That's really beautiful. And had that not been neglected so long, perhaps we would have more women. So yeah, that's one issue I can think of. Lamanites and the Book of Mormon historicity, looking at it through different lenses that are more sustainable and futuristic, looking at it through lenses such as archetypes and symbolic versions and different forms of interpretation, I think could really be improved on. I mean, my family, the Mexican side of my family, comes from a southern area in Mexico. It's called Tepecoculco. It's closest to Ozumba. And that section was the hotspot of the Third Convention, which was when a third of Mexican saints broke off because of Lamanite fundamentalism and Lamanite identity. So looking through multicultural lenses might be really beneficial. So yeah, there's plenty of things I think that we can. I mean, it's light. To me, I see a lot of light and a lot of opportunity for liberation on spiritual levels that make us all feel really peaceful and good. They are different frameworks. Most apologists are male, and most historians and researchers are male. Prophets are male. Bishops, stake presidents, all of those are male. So it's kind of hard to see different perspectives when the people representing perspectives tend to skew towards a marginalized, like white males or whatnot. And so I think there's so much space for growth and progress and peace and happiness and healing for a lot of these historical issues. So yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of hope.
Cool.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point. I mean, I feel like when I interact with my friends and family and these issues about Mormon history and Mormon problems are brought up, and even at the culture at large, like there seems to be um, like the relationship between men and women and women's relationship to men and vice versa is very I don't know if broken is the right word, but it's very injured, I would say, and that actually causes a lot of turmoil for, I think, members, because it's hard to trust one another, it's hard to trust leadership, it's hard to trust sources, and even people's motivations. So I think you bring up a good point, and I think anyone who knows me and sort of like the lobster crowd, we're not exactly woke, but I think we are insightful enough to understand like that is an actual issue that needs to be addressed. And then also with um, research on sort of like Lamanite type stuff. I mean, I think there is a lot of ground that hasn't been covered there. Some critics would even say, so like that Spanish speaking members may have even been disenfranchised, and so that's a gap that hasn't been addressed. And not only that, but the apologetic project it's not necessarily orchestrated, but there's also a gap there where there isn't Spanish content for Spanish speaking Latter-day Saints,
Oh, we were
and
talking about this the other day. Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
and so
especially the disenfranchisement. I mean, if people want to Google the Third Convention, this is where, and George Albert Smith, he was the one who really brought the church together after that difficulty. But there has been Mexican saints who disassociate from the church, and they undergo punishment for doing so, and they break off into fundamentalist groups. So fundamentalism isn't just a polygamist issue. People become fundamentalists over a whole range of issues. Racial
Yeah.
identity is one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so, I can't remember who said it, but someone said something like, nostalgia plus disenfranchisement produces fundamentalism, and I'm like, oh yeah,
Nostalgia
that's
plus fundamentalism, or plus
nostalgia plus disenfranchisement creates fundamentalism.
disenfranchisement.
Yeah, so that's an important issue. So anyway, I'm gonna let Don respond as well to the question. Don't want to take over.
Well, first, to what Jasmine said, so for instance, about the Third Convention, so here, what happened basically is in around the 1930s, for the church had been in Mexico for several decades, but the leaders who were the primary leaders who were chosen, like the mission presidency, were always Anglos, right? Anglo settlers in northern Mexico, whereas most of the church members in Mexico were Latino or indigenous, right?
Indigenous, the Mayan nose, very dark skin,
Right.
shorter,
Especially in southern Mexico.
Oh
right?
yeah, and yeah.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a growing discontent among the Mexican saints. Why, even though most of the Mexican saints were non-white, were the top leaders always white? And they experienced there was a civil war going on in Mexico during a certain period, and
there was orphans. There was a lot of poverty, and there was a lot of orphans. There were so many orphans wandering the streets. It was really hard. And so my great grandpa, he cared for those orphans, and it's hard because it's like this church, the New Jerusalem, as in the Book of Mormon, is supposed to be built by the Lamanites. So these saints in the early 1900s who had been told they were Lamanites, they couldn't figure out why there were children that were near starving in the New Jerusalem. And so their disenfranchisement definitely, history in different countries and different cultures, Mormon history, it's something that's very niche, and people don't really study a lot about this. And so, yeah, going back to your question of, are there things that are neglected? People of other cultures and women and children's perspectives, I would say too. Yeah, and there's so much space to grow. That's the beautiful part of history and faith development, is seeing the space that there is to grow. It's so bright. There's so much space to grow, and so much space to ascend to different levels of peace as a community. So I know there's a lot of critiques regarding apologetics and leaving the church and staying and whatnot, but from a very feminine point of view, there's a lot of space for creation, and there's a lot of creative material. And women, I don't think, are heard enough, so people don't listen to the beauty that there is to be had, the light, and that there is to be had. It is a very male-dominated conversation. So we think a lot about atonement and right and wrong and justice and mercy, that type of idea, which I think is protective, but it's not necessarily as creative as it could be.
Some more masculine rather than feminine.
Yeah. So representation of the feminine, I think, really would go a long ways. Femininity is healing. Femininity is creative. So yeah, I would say that.
Yeah. So
Cool. Oh, go ahead, John.
So once we reach a certain point in church history, we have a number of women's diaries, women's letters that really need to be mined much more to do the history. Unfortunately, when we're dealing with the very earliest years, that's when it's hardest to fill those gaps, because we have records that are created just overwhelmingly by men, And so a lot of very careful work actually needs to be done to reconstruct women's place in the early restoration, women's experience. But I'm an optimist, as you can tell by the fact that I wrote a book about the lost 116 pages. I'm an optimist about what
Where
we
they
can
at?
figure out about the past, right? And so you have to be kind of a crazy optimist to tackle that. But there are sources and there are methods that we can use to reconstruct that kind of thing. Same thing I would argue with women's experience and women's place in the early restoration. An example that creates a great analogy for this would be a book by a Latter-day Saint author about a non-Latter-day Saint topic. So Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is a Latter-day Saint historian who decades ago wrote a book called A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary. So Martha Ballard was a woman in the 1700s who left a diary, but to be honest, the diary mostly talks about very mundane things like her housework and so on. What Laurel Thatcher Ulrich shows, and I would commend this book to historians, budding historians, would-be scholars, right? As far as learning methodology, learning what can be done, we can take a source that in many ways seems very unpromising. How much could we really figure out from this diary that's mostly about her housework and the number of childbirth deliveries she did as a midwife and so on? She shows that there are ways of reading between the lines, there are ways of inferring from the information we're given to information that we're not explicitly given. This is much of what doing history is we take the records that we do have and we use them to infer things that we don't. And that's not a process of just like airy speculation. There are actually ways, again, like a detective, where there are examples. There's a wonderful book called The Idea of History by a historian and philosopher of history named Robin Collingwood, where the epilogues to the book, he has multiple epilogues that lay out the methodology for history. And he gives an example of how a detective could talk to a number of sources. They can all lie to him. It's like a murder case. Every single source lies to the detective.
Like Clue, the game Clue, yeah.
Every single source lies to the detective, but he can figure out from the patterns of their lies who did it, because people don't lie randomly. They lie in their own self-interest, right? So once you realize that, you can even use lies to figure out the truth, right? Just like a detective. A historian is a detective who studies things that happen in the more distant past rather than things that happen recently. It's the same kind of methodology. And so Laurel Thatcher Ulrich did this with a diary from the 1700s. We can do this with women's experience in the early restoration. I have, for instance, my own project that deals with like the elect lady revelation to Emma Smith, DNC 120, DNC not 125, cool. DNC 25, in its context. There's a ton that's actually there when we put it in its context. We read it carefully. We do exegesis on the text. So I would say...
Sorry, he said exegesis.
Exegesis, E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S, doesn't have the word Jesus in it. But
we don't want to exegese
out of a text systematically the meaning rather than reading into the text what we think it's saying.
Right.
This can be, there are all kinds of methods for doing this systematically.
So in church, when you hear, let's read this passage, and then you pull out what you read, that's
if you're pulling it out systematically based on what the text says, that's exegesis. If you're taking your assumptions and you're reading them into the text, that's the opposite. It's a less common word. That's eisegesis.
Eisegesis versus exegesis regarding reading the scriptures.
Right. Mm-hmm. So exegesis is actually an underused methodology in doing history, when it's basically like we torture the text systematically till it tells us what we want to know. Okay. There are ways of doing this, and in my own work, this is a method that I use. So almost any of my projects. Any of my publications that people read, if they go to for instance, go into academia.edu, find Don Bradley, I have a number of my publications there. Almost all of them use exegesis of early Latter-day Saint texts to figure out things about the history that we didn't know previously, or maybe didn't even think we could know. So people didn't necessarily think, I wouldn't have necessarily thought, as when I first found out about the lost pages, that we could figure out things that were in it, but we can't. Using the book of Mormon text we have and using other sources, we analyze them systematically. So I think that there's a lot of room to reconstruct women's experience. There's a lot of room to reconstruct all kinds of things about the early restoration that we wouldn't necessarily think we could in advance if we use careful methodology. One method that I would recommend, again, to sort of aspiring scholars, historians, would be, and I talk about this on almost every podcast I go on, is chronology. It seems like a small thing. It's not. Much of history is just getting the events in the right order. Imagine that you're a scientist trying to figure out physics, but you don't know what order events happen in. Could you ever reconstruct cause and effect relationships if you don't know what order the events happen in? You can't. It's the same thing with history.
I drop a marble, but if I let it go, then it falls and then it hits the ground. So there's multiple steps in chronology. So specifically,
how do you determine chronology, Don, when sometimes like you're relying on the dating methods of whatever's on there, right? Like so how do you determine what's actually accurate of what's, how do you put it in order?
Sure. First, so like what Jasmine was saying, you drop a marble, it falls and it hits the ground. If you didn't know what order those events happen in, does it drop first?
It's a misinterpretation.
Does it hit the ground first? Does it fall first? You could never figure out gravity, right?
Right. So what Trevor was saying, how do you rely on the dates?
Right. So that, I think often that actually gets complicated in assessing the events. So every history always relies on evidence, and sometimes the evidence takes the form of physical evidence. So for instance, I recently did an article about the skulls of Joseph Smith and Hiram, which we have photographs of, right?
Yeah.
And those tell us something about their martyrdom, their assassinations, right? Because we have physical evidence.
Yeah, these death masks.
Well, the death masks are.
Oh yeah, we want to ask you about that too if we get time.
We got Joseph and Hiram here with us, but usually though history relies on written sources, right? Overwhelmingly, it relies on written sources. So generally, we just have a set of written sources. Pardon me. So we have to figure out. We look at the different written. We don't know anything about what happened in the past without written sources. In fact, if it weren't for written sources, we wouldn't even know that these physical evidence is a death mask or death mask of Joseph and Hiram, right? So we use the different written sources, and we have to kind of do detective work. We have to kind of do inference, which the way exactly that we do that varies kind of from case to case. So it's a little bit hard to lay out just like a general methodology for that. So sometimes some of these things, it's almost easier to show in practice how we do it in a specific case than to talk about how we do it in general.
Okay, that's fine. Just to drill down a little bit on historical methods, if that's okay. I'm just going to ask since I have the floor here. Is there any like criteria that you consistently use to evaluate the reliability of sources? How do you account for potential biases of whether that be from an LDS source or a non-LDS source? And then maybe what are some pitfalls that you see, like common pitfalls of people who maybe aren't historians that try to dig into this stuff, but like what are some of the mistakes that they make when going through this?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions, and I mean this gets into some of the stuff that like excites historians, right? Like it's cool how how we work with the sources, right? It's fun, it's fascinating. So okay, this remind me of the second question because I was about to answer it, but
just common pitfalls that people have.
Common pitfalls, okay.
Yeah.
So the way that historians and non-historians tend to understand sources and how to use them tends to be very different, okay? So again, that book, which I highly recommend to anyone who's actually interested in doing history, The Idea of History by Robin Collingwood, okay? The main body of the text is actually sort of a history of the idea of history or the doing of history, kind of. It's the epilogues that interest me the most. They're about historical methodology, okay? So he says that non-historians and bad historians tend to treat their historical sources, as authorities. Whereas good historians, he argues, treat their sources as evidence. So think about the distinction, okay?
Yeah.
If you think of historical sources as authorities, okay, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to say who was most authoritative in their account, who should we rely on? And then he says the idea is you kind of try to sort out your different authorities and say, well, there were 5 people who gave accounts of this event. Their accounts are different. Let's say the Kirtland Temple dedication, okay? Let's say we have 5, and we have more than that for the Kirtland Temple dedication, but let's say we have 5, okay? What happened? We have differing accounts from Joseph Smith, David Whitmer, and so on, right? A number of sources. So the accounts differ somewhat. So do we just, in the view that historical sources are authorities, what we do is we sort of say, well, who was the most authoritative of all the sources? Maybe we say, well, this person was there, this person wasn't, so this person's better. Maybe we say, this person left the church, so we discount them, David Whitmer, okay? We say, well, Joseph Smith didn't leave the church, right? So he's more authoritative. Well, Joseph Smith was the prophet too, so maybe we make him more authoritative. And then we say, therefore, he is on top in this sort of hierarchy of sources. So he trumps all these other sources. So let's discount all these and just go with his account. So whatever he said is what we know about it, and we don't know anything else about it. We just know what he said.
And that's how lawyers do history, right? Is that
lawyers? Yeah. To be honest with you, yes.
Yeah.
Lawyers tend to treat their sources as authorities. Lawyers tend to not make good historians. I'll put that out there, okay?
Sorry, guys. Love you.
When
Yeah,
I
it's
see
two different disciplines.
when I see attorneys do history, I don't think they usually do it well. They usually have a predictable pattern of flaws in how they do history. For one thing, they're used to arguing a side of something, okay? An attorney's job is to argue one side of something. Their job is not to figure out the truth. A detective's job is to figure out the truth. An attorney's job is to make a case for something for their side, okay? One of those prepares you better for doing history than the other, okay? So a historian basically is a detective. There's a lot of resonance between this. A good historian is not an attorney.
Yeah.
If a historian is acting like an attorney, they're not being a good historian because they're trying to make a case for something. Attorneys get experience working with a somewhat arbitrary set of rules. So in the law, there's a concept called hearsay, which is if you didn't hear it directly, but you heard it from somebody else, we dismiss that whole category of testimony. That's hearsay, that's inadmissible, okay?
Is it like different levels, like first, second, third level?
It's
So
not
hearsay.
it's not even necessarily levels. It's this whole category of testimony we completely dismiss. We don't even talk about it. We don't even consider it. Okay?
Okay.
So whereas historians actually will look more kind of at levels of credibility,
Oh.
it's better to be a first-hand source than to be a second-hand source. But that doesn't mean being a second-hand source is worthless. So that comports more with how we do things in everyday life. So if you think about, there's someone that you know, they didn't experience directly that someone did something, but they tell you that the person who did it told them that they did it. Are you just like, well, you didn't experience that firsthand, so I will never believe anything that you say about this? That's not usually how we operate as humans. We give some degree of credit to secondhand testimony or even third-hand testimony, right? In everyday life. Doing history is actually more like everyday life than it is like the law, because the law is a system of rules, some of which are arbitrary, right? And so historians don't have to act based on arbitrary rules like attorneys do. They can be more like detectives who don't need to abide by arbitrary rules like that.
They just look at the little details.
They're trying to figure out, detectives are trying to figure out what happened. Attorneys are trying to make a case for something based on a set of rules. Those are two different things.
Totally.
Historian is a detective, not an attorney. At least a good historian is a detective. A bad historian is an attorney. Okay. they try to make a case for something, they arbitrarily dismiss certain testimony.
Right.
Well, and so specifically with Joseph Smith and polygamy, there is a lot of incentive to make this look clean, to make this look, to wrap this up in a pretty package and put a bow on top and make it look not like a smoky fire in a dumpster rolling towards an elementary school, right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
right, excuse me, but, right. And so this is where I think that, decentivizing that and finding other ways to look at prophetic fallibility actually allows multiple things to be true at one time. And I do think a large part of that is a practice in non-duality, in looking at like you versus the other, you versus Joseph Smith, you versus God, you versus the Heavenly Mother. Things like that kind of take the edge off of trying to make things look perfect.
Sure.
So people tend to widen their window of tolerance to be able to accept certain things and hold other things as valid and true. And it does take, at least for women with this issue, which I think is what Don was speaking to when he was talking about the sources. With women, it does take a lot of embodiment practices and emotional and mental and cognitive health to be able to handle these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're looking at like the sources of Joseph Smith, some of them really are hard. And so to be able to hold that while maintaining some type of prophetic understanding does actually take a lot of complexity in emotional regulation and in thought and in intellectual and spiritual development. And so how people parse that out really, I think, is the spiritual path. Not having a black and white view and having to discount large swaths of history in order to make something true or valid, holding both, maintaining both, I think is really important. Going back to the initial question about faith development, I mean, faith crisis, I think, is when people are on like their last couple heartbeats. I think most of us are actually in a faith development space where we're not about to die, but we're actually not thriving. And so a lot of it has to do with raising our vibration by holding multiple levels of complexity through multiple dimensions, not just historical and spiritual and emotional. All of those incorporate into something that is an elevated state. So I really love what Don was saying about being very complex about the sources.
So how would you, I know we're going to wrap this up soon because you guys have been very generous with your time, so I appreciate it. Just real quick, I maybe this isn't a quick answer, but as far as like accounting for like biases in historical records, because any account's going to have every account has a bias, and you have your own bias as a historian.
Sure, right. So first to go to what Jasmine was alluding to. So Jasmine was alluding to the fact that much of the distinction, let me put it this way, the most prominent current manifestation of how historians and non-historians tend to look at sources differently is probably regarding the question of Joseph Smith and polygamy, right?
Yeah.
So there are people in the Restoration who are skeptical that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, right? And so the way that they tend to talk about historical sources and analyze historical sources tends to be a lot different than that of historians. And so then they seem to be very mystified. How do historians come to the conclusion that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy when, let's say, most of the sources saying that he did are very late relative to when he did it? So Joseph Smith practicing polygamy in the 1840s. The first systematic attempt to gather testimonies about his polygamy is in 1869. So they're saying, that's 25 years after he died. How do we know that, that testimony wasn't just doctored or something like that, right? So two questions about like bias in the historical record. How do we weigh out the different historical sources? As a historian, my respect for the more time goes on, the more respect I have for the sources in general. So years ago, when I was outside the church and I thought Joseph Smith was a fraud, okay, an opportunist, basically a con man, I encountered this source from Diedrich Willers Jr. He was the son of the Whitmer family's minister, okay? And he left a testimony in like the 1880s, very late, where he was saying the Whitmer family, they were very credulous, they believed all kinds of superstitious things. And he said, let me give you an example. When Joseph Smith moved from Pennsylvania to New York to stay with the Whitmers while I was translating the Book of Mormon, the angel appeared right after he arrived and told, and it was the 12th time that the angel appeared. And so Joseph said this was a sign that he was supposed to stay at the Whitmer home till the translation was finished. Well, I didn't have a bias in favor of Joseph Smith or Mormonism. I was an ex-Mormon atheist, right? But I looked at the source and it was like, he's trying to show they were superstitious. He's using this as an example. I don't think this really ever happened, okay? Then I started doing chronology work and I discovered that First Nephi 1 was translated right about that time. And in First Nephi 1, Lehi sees Christ descending from heaven with the brightness of the sun, followed by 12 others. It's like, oh, that's interesting. The number 12 shows up in that experience. Around the same time, I also discovered DNC 18 was given. It says that they were supposed to choose 12 disciples, right? Which ultimately later, first it leads them to choose 12 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, the 8, the 3, and Joseph Smith. Later it leads them to choose the 12 quorum of the 12 apostles. I was like, wait a minute, the number 12 keeps popping up at this exact time. And I thought, that's really going to be coincidence if Diedrich Willer's account is just made up later. And so I started to realize from that experience and others that actually most of the historical sources are telling us something real about the past. We just need to be careful in sifting the sources. And one of the big things that historians do to validate sources is that they look at how the sources cross-validate one another, okay? So with Joseph Smith's polygamy, for instance, there are other stronger examples, but I'm kind of saving those for future podcasts on Joseph Smith and polygamy, okay?
They need time to be laid out, yeah.
So when people were leaving the church in Nauvoo, like first John C. Bennett, then William Law and others, Austin Cowles and others who were on the Nauvoo High Council, they were saying first, John C. Bennett saying Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Here are some of the women he's married to. Well, some of those same women in Utah are giving affidavits saying they were married to Joseph Smith. Why is an enemy of Joseph Smith and people friendly to Joseph Smith, why are they identifying the same women as Joseph Smith's wives if there isn't something to that, right? When you look at the testimonies given by William Law, Austin Cowles, and others in Nauvoo, they're saying DNC 132 was read to me by Hiram Smith, and here's the gist of what it said. Well, then later we have the text of DNC 132 presented in Utah, and it has basically those things in it. Why is it that enemies of Joseph Smith and Nauvoo, who were also enemies of polygamy, they were against polygamy, they said Joseph Smith is practicing polygamy and we don't believe it. Why are enemies of polygamy and friends of polygamy both saying Joseph Smith had a revelation that said the same thing if there's not something to it? And so what we have is a sort of cross-validation of the sources. So it's not a matter of how do we hierarchically arrange the sources to know, oh, this is reliable, but this is unreliable. It's how the sources relate to one another and what can we infer from that. That's more of what a detective does, right? A detective doesn't say, well, so-and-so said that this and so-and-so said that. This person's more reliable, so we're going to discount everything this person says and totally go with this person's count. People speak from their own perspectives. People speak from their own biases. We don't just take one person's account and dismiss all the others. We take the various accounts and see how they relate to one another to get at truths, even truths that they're not telling us, like in the example of how everyone can be lying to a detective and the detective can figure out from their lies the truth of what happened.
Awesome.
Well, and this brings up a bigger conversation in Mormonism, which is the conversation of monogamy and non-monogamy. Is non-monogamy and monogamy marriage and sex, or does flirtation fit in? you know, or does emotional non-monogamy fit in? I mean, and so non-monogamy in general is a very unexplored topic in Mormonism. And the different levels and the different states. I mean, marriage and sex are kind of like the hardcore ultimate form of non-monogamy, ritualized marriage and actual sexual activity. But there are multiple shades before people get to that, you know, concrete stage. And so, where is the line? And in general, I'm not sure if even LDS standards has that line well defined in regards to the emotional and spiritual aspects of it. You know, it's an evolving conversation about it. So when women look at the sources, and this is why I think women looking at the sources is so important, women tend to not value the same things men value. And so, you know, when it comes to emotionality and flirtation, looking at Joseph Smith's emotionality and flirtation in general is a whole nother topic. Men tend to look at sex and marriage. Like, where are the documents for marriage? You know, where is the proof of sex? You know, that type of line of thinking tends to be men's, but women tend to think differently about emotions and flirtation and you know, Don just did some really cool research on the Nauvoo marriage code, which actually is about finances and deeding out property to different plural wives. And so that's really interesting. So deducing it down to marriage and sex, I think, is a really black and white conversation. I think non-monogamy is probably a lot more than that. So when looking at Joseph Smith, people seem to be analyzing sex and marriage.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, Jasmine. So this is a topic that you're obviously very, you know, far deep down the rabbit hole, so to speak. You know a lot about this, and so I want to be able to pick your brain a little bit before we wrap up here. So one of the things that when I met you at the lobster thing, you know, last month or whatever, one of the things that was super interesting to
That was
me.
so fun, by the way.
Yeah, that was awesome. It's great to meet you. You
Alejandro
guys,
made some good hot dogs.
yeah, got to do it again. Uh, so one of the things that was super interesting to me was a few things. You know, typically when we think about polygamy, we think about it like very, very narrowly, right? We think about it just in the LDS lens of like, you know, one man and, you know, however many wives, right? And it's kind of more patriarchal and whatever.
That's been history, yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to just to kind of give a brief little, you know, overview of different forms of polygamy, maybe, and you know, different, you know, other reasons for polygamy other than just sex, like polymaternalism,
Yeah.
you know, and then you also talked about how when I think about polygamy, I think of it as a fundamentalist thing, like through the fundamentalist lens, but it's also, which is kind of like if you look at it through like a right and left lens, it's like extremely far right? Extremely conservative, right?
Yeah,
But
like a
you kind of explained how like it's actually becoming like the very far left side is a different form of polygamy. So could you? Sorry, I just kind of threw a lot at you, but if you could just kind of give a brief overview, I think the audience would.
It's a really great question. I mean, in my early 20s, I was traveling fundamentalist Mormon communities. I was fascinated. I was like, how does this work? Why do people do this? And then in my mid 20s, I started studying non-religious or secular non-monogamy communities, or polyamory is what most people call it, or ethical non-monogamy. So I've seen it from what you're saying, both sides, the conservative religious fundamentalist side, and also like the LGBTQ deconstruct gender side. So yeah, I see what you're saying. It tends to be on both ends. Like something suppressed in the middle tends to go to the sides. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's more research, academic research on the polyamorous side than the religious side, though there is a lot of really cool Mormon. Well, and this is the cool thing about Mormonism and family structure is that we do have, well, Mormonism is the largest American grown religion. And then we're also one of the largest hotspots of polygamy. And polygamy is defined as multiple men or multiple women per man and multiple men per woman. Is that right?
So the
Polygyny.
right,
Oh, go ahead.
right.
Polygyny.
So the way that we usually use the word polygamy, especially in the Latter-day Saint
both.
context, is, well, no, the way the people usually use it is just to refer to what's actually technically polygyny, which is one man, multiple wives, or multiple women.
Yeah.
But really, the specific definition of polygamy is actually the broad term, just meaning multiple marriages or multiple partners.
Right.
Polygyny means multiple wives or multiple women. Polyandry means multiple men or multiple husbands.
Right. So historically, Mormons have practiced polygyny, so
Right.
one man, multiple wives. But we actually have more research with secular non-monogamy, but we have a lot with polygyny, Mormon polygyny. That's really cool. I mean, seeing it from like a children's perspective, and so what you were talking about, polymaternalism, is really cool research. There are a lot of trauma survivors in Mormon polygyny, unfortunately. However, I've never heard one of those trauma survivors hate how many mothers they've had. You know, they always tend to love the multiple mothers and multiple maternal gifts that each mother has to give the children. So there are more facets of this polygamy diamond other than men and hormones. Though I think that definitely needs to be talked about. You know, in these fundamentalist communities, different fundamentalist communities have different levels of issues and also different strengths. And that's something that, like Alejandro, you're a psychologist, studying different psychology in different groups is fascinating. And so, yeah, I mean, other than it being a religious, I encourage everyone to go to a fundamentalist church, even if it's not for religious curiosity, even if it's for just psychological or sociological understanding of why people are different. Why do they do this? You know, how do they do this? Like, how does this fit into their long-term plan for fulfillment and legacy? Like, what does this look like with older polygamous people who are in their 80s? I mean, so I'm really interested in those questions. I think a lot of people are very stuck in polygamy is good or bad, or Joseph Smith practiced polygamy or he didn't, so it's valid or not. I'm more interested in, like, how does it work? You know? And that is a really fruitful conversation because being more neutralized about it allows the history to be seen more clearly, and also the future. Right. Is it a restored principle? And most of my best friends are polygamist women, and they do see themselves as Zion builders. They literally labor from sun up to sundown to build their Zion. That's very wholehearted spirituality. Oh, woo! Yeah.
I just got at the Zion National Park.
Not just a bank or a national park, people.
Yeah, we love it all. So it's Utah. It's the promised land over here.
That's right.
Go ahead.
So just was talking about, like, we can take, there's obviously this historical lens on Mormon polygyny.
Yeah.
We also can take a kind of sociological lens, right, on what does this practice actually look like, what are the different forms that it takes in different communities, restoration communities or communities outside of restoration, religious, like Islamic polygamy, or non-religious, right, secular.
I mean, there's so many here in Utah County. The problem with polygamists and LDS is they kind of are like oil and water, because I think polygamists are scared of LDS, and I think LDS are scared of polygamists. So they live on the same block, but they avoid each other like the plague.
Yeah.
So there's so many polygamists here in Utah County and fundamentalists who really are very wholehearted people who are very religiously sincere in their beliefs and in their ways of choosing their family structure. So, I mean, that's something that's not a question. Joseph Smith practicing polygamy or not does not answer why people live this in religious sincerity, you know?
Sure.
And so do we make space for that in the restoration? Do we make space for, is the restoration expansive, or is it kind of like buckle down, follow the rules, smaller, or is it expansive into this idea of like, what does Heavenly Mother look like? What does, ultimate expansion look like? And I think that the human brain, so little of the human brain is used per minute, And so what is incorporating all parts of the human brain to where there's singularity? Like, what does that look like in family structure? So that's why I think Mormonism is so cool, because it has such an expansive nature, which actually kind of pops into a singularity. So I don't know, my perspective there.
Super cool. Thank you.
A long time, but I think
So,
something that's come up kind of implicitly in some of the Jasmine's comments and in what I was saying about historical methodology would be the subject of skepticism that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, generally known as the polygamy deniers, right? Although I think even some of the people who take that approach use the term polygamy deniers, but I know it's also based on like Holocaust deniers, so some of them kind of find it offensive, right? It's something that gets talked about a fair amount or responded to on the Latter-day Lobsters group. So it might be worth taking at least a few minutes to address that head on instead of sort of skirting around it.
Sure.
So there had been a few male scholars recently who have tried to address the phenomenon of quote unquote polygamy denial, Joseph Smith polygamy denial, and they have tried to account for it primarily through a sort of broadly sociological lens, saying like, well, this fits into sort of contemporaneous rejection of expertise. So like with people who are anti-vaxxers, they are obviously rejecting a certain kind of expertise in the medical community. There's overlap between that group and the Joseph Smith polygamy skeptics. I think that's true, but I also, and there are other things where they try to say, well, these are people, they just don't know historical methodology. I earlier was saying something about how historians and non-historians view historical sources and how to use them differently, and so I think that's a factor. But I think there's actually like sort of an elephant in the room that gets ignored in these discussions, and where I think there's much room for greater understanding of others and empathy for others. And most people who are in the category of quote unquote polygamy deniers appear to be Latter-day Saint women.
They do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you think about,
I run groups for polygamy, and the majority are Latter-day Saint women. They are.
yeah.
Yeah.
So why would primarily Latter-day Saint women be denying that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy? Well, imagine that we were talking about the reverse. Imagine that we were talking about the founder of our faith practiced polyandry, and our founding prophetess, had 40 husbands. Okay? And because she had 40 husbands and had a revelation about celestial polyandry, where it was understood in the early church that if you didn't live in a family with multiple husbands, your family would not be an eternal family, you would not be exalted. And then imagine that the current sealing practices were such that even if you were in a monogamous couple, if you died before your wife, right, she could remarry, you were sealed to her, she could remarry in the temple without you having consented to it. You're dead, right? Without you consenting to it, she could remarry another man in the temple, and the expectation would be that you would share your wife forever in the celestial kingdom. Now, personally, to me, right, that's not my idea of the celestial kingdom. That's not my idea of heaven. That's my personal idea of hell. And so, if
I'm getting more red pilled by the minute.
Nothing, right? Yeah. And so, imagine that that's the situation, and that there were female scholars telling you, no, like our founder really did practice polygamy, really did have 40 husbands. And by the way, it looks like probably she started marrying those additional husbands without her first husband's consent, or maybe even knowledge, right? How would this feel? So to me, it thinking about it, that feels hellish. It feels horrible, right? And so if that's the narrative that you're being given, and then when you question that narrative, you have female scholars telling you, no, you don't know what you're talking about. This is you just don't understand historical methodology, right? Like they would be missing something here, which is they're missing how you're experiencing this information, and the fact that it looks and feels really icky and horrible, and it doesn't look ethical what she, our founding prophetess, did. Why did she need 40 husbands? Like, marrying husbands without her first husband's consent? Like, how would her first husband have experienced that? How would you experience that, right? And so, like, to not address any of, so are the quote unquote deniers telling is their narrative the historical truth? Well, no trained historian that I know thinks it is.
No, it's
right?
not a historical truth. It's absolutely an emotional truth. And so when I see people throw another source and then throw another source and then throw another source at a polygamy denier woman who's literally trying her hardest to keep her faith together, to keep her family in the church, to keep her marriage together. I mean, I'm just the insensitivity. I am just kind of like, man, these polygamy denying women, they're there for a reason, you know. I really advocate a lot of compassion and love for all sides of this.
And I think it can be perceived sometimes too, like from a male perspective. It's complicated. I mean, different people are different ways, but I think from a male perspective, men lots of times are interested in facts, right? And so when they're arguing just from a fact basis, you know, women are taking that from an emotional basis, like, oh, you seem to think that they're taking like, oh, you just want to have polygamy, and so that's why you're arguing from that perspective, which I'm sure that's the case in some cases. But
and you know what, the fundamentalists, they advocate for polygamous marriage to be valid and monogamous, you know. And so you know, so yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's about the family structure. I think it's about the choice in to the family structure. So if it's forced on you, you are going to be polyandrous, you are going to be happy about it, and if not, you're going to be punished. That's a whole different thing than if you're like choosing into it. Right? And so I think the reaction is largely because if you look at the history, it doesn't seem, there are levels of consent. So there's like informed consent, which is having all the information, and then there's non-coerciveness, which is ask once, and if you get a no means no. Don't continue to press and put high pressure tactics. We see this in sales, you know, no high pressure sales or something, you know. And so there are different levels of consent, and when we look at the history, it's like, was it consensual? And that's where we get into these faith issues of like, can you hold that things were potentially not done the best and still hold prophetic inspiration? I've paved a way to do so, and it does take a lot of complexity and a lot of thought work to pave my neurology to move in more complex ways to where I can maintain multiple things. So it's not denying, but it's also not rejecting. It's like a middle path.
And by the way, I don't mean for what I said earlier to mean that women can't think clearly and they can't have facts. That's not what I mean at all.
I didn't think so.
But anybody watching this, I want to clear the air there. So
I actually was gonna comment on that. Right, I understood what you're saying, but I also think, having talked with, for instance, Michelle Stone, who is the most prominent skeptic on that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, she finds it personally offensive to have this just dismissed as her emotions, because she has done a lot of delving into the sources, she has done a lot of thinking about it, right? And so she feels like that's actually just a dismissal, right? So we're not trying to dismiss, right? Like like, oh, men
Yeah.
are factual, women are emotional, therefore we just dismiss these things because they're just emotions. There's no, for one thing, there's no just here, right?
Well, let's talk
And-
about polyandry, and we can talk about emotions.
Right.
'Cause
Well,
men,
let me.
women handle high levels of polygamy. Men cannot handle polyandry. You know, we start talking about polyandry and potential polyandry, and you see men have emotional reactions, and so it's neither
Sure.
one or the other. We're both more the
Right.
same.
If the
Yeah.
conversation were
Yeah.
reversed and our founder had practiced polyandry, and you might, if your spouse, if
You're
you
like,
died
"Hell
before
no.
your spouse,
Hell no."
you might and feel like you were going to get stuck in a totally polyandrous marriage. You would have a lot of emotions. I would have a lot of emotions. So it's not just about like women being more emotional than men.
Correct.
It's about there are different cognitive and emotional demands that are made on women in looking at Mormon history, Mormon theology, Latter-day Saint sealing practices than is expected of men, right?
Yeah.
It's not equal
Correct.
weight. And
Yeah.
so, like Jasmine was saying,
Totally agree.
when we look at early Latter-day Saint polygamy, for instance, and see there were things that weren't done the best way, there are ethical problems in what was done, but still hold Joseph Smith was a prophet, you know, the church is like,
Yeah.
there's a validity here. Well, I think we can, absolutely, because look at D&C 132. In verse 50, it refers to Joseph's, it's a revelation about polygamy, and it's specifically addressing in this part Joseph's relationship with Emma. In verse 50, it refers to Joseph's sins. In verse 60, it refers to Joseph's transgressions. In verse 56, it refers to Joseph's trespasses against Emma and asks her to forgive him those trespasses. Does that make it sound to you like he did everything right? Because it doesn't make it sound like that to me. And I actually think that if we analyze the law of Sarah, which
Oh, that's
is
a whole
a
other thing.
right, but I think even if we analyze how it's worded in D&C 132, it actually implies that Joseph had initially gone forward without Emma, without seeking Emma's consent, which is all kinds of problematic. So even
It's violating
the people
consent.
who most defend Joseph's rightness in what he did, who are very aware of these things. So Brian Hales, I think unquestionably, has a great deal of knowledge about Joseph Smith's polygamy, but also unquestionably is very motivated to defend Joseph Smith. He has said it very subtly, but he, several years ago, he came up with some sort of blog post saying something, titled something like 10 things I wish Joseph Smith had done differently in his polygamy. And he says, well, I wish he had, talked to Emma first. I wish he had done this. That's a very soft-pedaled way of saying what I think D&C 132 is describing as sins, transgressions, and trespasses.
Yeah.
That's harder language. I think if Joseph's own revelations are saying he made mistakes, I don't see why Latter-day Saints would need to feel afraid of saying he made mistakes. The question there isn't, is there something valid to polygamy? It's, was it all done properly, correctly, in the best way? And if it wasn't, might that be part of why people are having sort of traumatic reactions to it? If they're not just reacting to the thing itself, maybe they're reacting to some of how it was done in ways that weren't the best way.
I think I can speak a bit to that from a psychological perspective. So, John Vervaeke, he's a professor at the University of Toronto, and his sort of focus is on meaning making and how people make sense of the world around them. And he sort of came up with a framework for how people make sense of things. And so, this framework sort of has like 3 pillars or 3 categories in it. And the first one is something like narrative. So people don't have possession of all the facts, and so the best they can do is they have a narrative of whatever is the case. And so in the Latter-day Saint tradition, we don't just have like history narrative in scripture, but we have like meta narratives. And so history isn't just history, it's history in light of how is the restoration unfolding, and how is that in service of the plan of salvation and the exaltation of mankind. So that's one way in which we sort of make sense of things. The second way we make sense of things is what he called like a normative order, and that's something like ethics and self-transcendence. And so when people read history, in my opinion, I think people read it for the facts, but then they also, the instinct is to then make moral judgments on the past and say, hey, the founding fathers did X, Y, and Z, the prophets did X, Y, and Z, and this is good and this is bad. And then to make sense of things, it's like, if you think about the narrative of a prophet, the narrative you kind of have is like a prophet is called of God, and they're more or less like chosen by God, and so that presumes that maybe they're good. But then you really dive deep into it, and you find out, oh well, these prophets aren't actually exemplar people. Only Jesus was. But it actually the emotion is sort of like a violation of that meaning making. It's like, oh, I this narrative doesn't conform to what is actually the case. And then on top of that, like my normative order is violated too, because I thought X, Y, and Z was the correct way, and they violated that, and maybe we're violating this. And so that emotional, like that emotional response to discovering that someone did wrong is powerful. And in the debate between Jacob Isbell and Jacob Hansen, it was striking to see Jacob Hansen making a historical, I would say, narrative case, but Jacob Isbell was making a moral, more of normative case. And Jacob's argument was, I have proof for why Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, whereas Jacob Isbell was arguing something like, I have a scriptural case for why polygamy is immoral. And so they were sort of talking past each other. But what I see from both of them is they're making sense of this whole mess, using two different sort of lenses. And then the last lens is what they call a nomological lens, and that's more like scientific, factual type things. I think history sort of fits in there for Latter-day Saints, and I would say maybe even psychology. But what are the actual like facts? And so from a bottom up and ground up, it's like you have the narrative and the facts, and then the moral or the ethical implications. And are all those in harmony? And if they are, then that makes a lot of sense. But when we find out that maybe they're not perfectly in harmony, then we say, wait a second, Joseph Smith practiced polygamy? That doesn't make sense. And so then we're skeptical of the whole thing. So I don't want to discount the polygamy deniers as just emotional, capricious people, but I think they're trying to make sense of history, and I think where they are sort of lacking is that they're not aware that their blind spot is that they're imposing a lot of moral presumptions, and they're ignorant, I think, of ethical methods and stuff like that. But it's all wrapped up in the experience of like heightened emotions and moral claims, and so it's tricky. I don't want to be insensitive to them, but also I think they should be aware that all of those things are in play for them. But
Can I say one thing? So
sure, go ahead, and then we gotta wrap up.
Yeah, we gotta wrap up, but appreciate
your
my friends are polygamist women, and they don't know. Very few of them actually know Joseph Smith sources, so they don't buy into it for sources either.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look, it's a very male-centric conversation. Joseph Smith did or didn't. Joseph Smith revealed this or that. Or Joseph Smith, but women don't have a stake in that game because they frankly can't. They're not given a stake in that game. So their buy-ins to this have nothing to do with authority or scripture. And I run two big groups on polygamy and fundamentalism, and then a secondary group on just polygamy in general, where I see a lot of LDS women. And the reality is they don't know about scriptures or sources as well as polygamy deniers. And so on both sides, I'm not saying polygamy denier women are emotional. I'm saying on both sides, women think differently.
Yeah.
Women think about polymaternalism a lot. Women think about sisterhood a lot. Women think about what you were saying about transcendence. Women think about transcendence a lot, and how polygamy can be a source of transcendence, not through suppression, but through compersion. There's a lot of research on compersion and empathy towards sister wives. So their buy-in to that lifestyle really isn't scriptural or authoritative. you kind of find that the women that grow up in fundamentalism stay in the church they're in. They don't have these conversion stories to, oh, Rulon Allred has the priesthood, not Barlow, or you know, they don't think in terms of authority. They think in terms of community and health of children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, and they think of things differently. So in general, it's a very male dominated discourse that I think talking about it through the eyes of women would probably be beneficial in the polygamous sense, but also in the sense of the Book of Mormon, like how that looks like with apologetics there and overall faith development. I think the mother is the healer. And, you know, Jesus Christ, he was crucified. He suffered for our sins. He was crucified, and then he was taken up to heaven, and then he comes down healed. So what happened when he was in heaven? My personal theory, and I've heard this a couple other places, is that the mother was the healer of him in heaven, and then he came down. So there has to be a masculine and feminine balance in all of this. And so I think the healer is an important thing to, and you know what, the lobsters are so cool about archetypes. I've seen Morgan and a lot of really cool thinkers. There are some really awesome thinkers on the lobsters and some really cool synchronicities. So I absolutely love the group. So
Thank you. Yeah. No, it's fun to explore these topics for sure. And I wish we could, I don't know, are we ready for hour 3? I'm definitely not.
Yeah, we can do it all night, man.
I would say maybe if I could, do you mind if I have a last comment?
of course.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. And then we got to wrap.
When Jasmine and I were talking earlier about doing this podcast, one of the things we talked about that's been on both of our minds a lot lately is just compassion for difference, right? People, sometimes men and women, but also across faith divides, Latter-day Saints and ex-Mormons, other divides, political divides. People think differently. They think differently based on different life experiences and so on. And we don't know. I've had recent demonstrations to me that we don't know what other people suffer. We don't. Think of your own sufferings. Who knows everything that you've suffered other than you? No one. Right? That's the same for other people too. We don't know what anyone else has suffered. Given that, given our common humanity, given that we have different experiences, given that it takes different kinds of people to run a community, to run a world, that's a beneficial thing, can't we all have compassion for one another across whatever differences of opinion, religious, political, historical, whatever it is? Like this emerges for us so much in the things that we experience, the things that we talk about as a couple, right? Just seeing that there's so much space for compassion to other people, and that might be in some of our online discussions, the quote-unquote polygamy deniers. It might be ex-Mormons. It might be people who take opposite political views. If we can just have compassion for others, that would go so far, so that then maybe we could talk more about ideas, we could talk more about experiences, and not feel personally at odds with other people. We can grow in our understanding of one another and really progress. And when we talked earlier about the idea a little bit of Zion, right? That, how do we get there? I mean, surely mutual understanding and compassion has got to be so much of the path to Zion.
Amen.
Awesome. Hey, thank you for sharing that. And I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think, being, perspective taking, being compassionate, is going to help us really build Zion more quickly than other methods, more negative methods. But thank you everyone for all your comments. This has been fantastic. I wish I could speak more, but we're just out of time.
Yeah, and so we get your questions, guys. This was awesome. I would do this for 6 hours, but we gotta, we gotta. Thank you everyone, and thanks for everyone who contributed and asked questions. And we'll have you guys on again in the future. And
Awesome.
Thank you guys so much.
We're now in Zion.
All right, there you go.
Figured it out.
All right. Let me go ahead and end.
Thanks,
Let me go end on the different platforms, and I'll be right back with everyone.